Start.
Okay, recording's begun.
Well, welcome everybody to a very special event that I am very, very proud to be hosting. So I'm Marilee Adams from the Inquiry Institute, and many of you are joining us today because you got an email from the Inquiry Institute saying, my husband Ed has written this wonderful book with his colleague, Ed Fronheim. It's Reinventing Masculinity, which Ed, you can hold up. And I thought, how wonderful. I have all of these people in our community. And I would love you to meet Ed, and I'd love you to meet the other Ed also. You can see how the Eds have gotten confusing. And in fact, at one of their events, they said two Eds are better than one. It's just so. So I'm going to ask both of the Eds to introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump into a conversation about the book and the concepts and very powerful ideas in the book about reinventing masculinity. And the subtitle is The Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection. So the three of us will have an interchange for maybe 20-ish minutes, and then we'll have time for some conversation, not just Q&A, but conversation with each other. So think about what gets provoked for you, what gets inspired for you, what questions you have, what comments you have, and make notes. And then we get to the conversational part, then we can all be together that way. So I am happy to introduce you to my husband, Dr. Edward Adams.
Hi, everybody. Before I introduce myself, let me say that both Ed and I believe that much of the issues in the world that are the darker issues have an underpinning in them of the way that we perceive men and masculinity. And so we consider this to be an extraordinarily important topic that has great depth and meaning to it. I am a psychologist. I got my doctoral work at Rutgers University. I specialize in the treatment of men. I have probably about 95% of my caseload are men or couples. And 30 years ago, I founded an organization called Men Mentoring Men, which is a nonprofit organization. You could look that up, menmentoringmen.org. And it was designed for men of all walks of life to get together and discuss how to become healthier and happier in their life. It is not therapy. It is peer run, and it is something that has lasted for 30 years because important things happened there. I'm also past president of Division 51 of the American Psychological Association. Division 51 is the division devoted to the study and understanding of boys and men. And the other part of my life has been as a professional artist, painter and sculptor. Some of my work is in the book, Reinventing Masculinity. I have work in public places, sculptures in museums. I was fortunate to do a sculpture honoring Raoul Wallenberg, who was a Swedish diplomat who saved 100,000 lives from Eichmann and the Nazis. I also did a bust of Oskar Schindler that was given to Spielberg to thank him for making Schindler's List. So it's not a hobby, it's a parallel career. And I have the pleasure of being married to Marilee, and which we've been married for a couple of decades, and I've loved every moment of it.
Most every moment of it.
Most every moment of it. Yeah.
I'm going to add one thing because Ed brought in the part about his art. So I'm going to show you also another book of his, which I'm trying to square this. It's called Becoming a Happier Man, and Man's Guide to Living a Full and Meaningful Life. So it's very clear that Ed is immersed in really at the leading edge of thinking about masculinity and gender and humanity, and how we can all expand and grow together.
And the book was co-written with Ed Fraunheim, who has a great deal of writing skills and a great mind. And so, Ed, would you introduce yourself to everyone?
Thanks, Ed, and thanks, Marilee, as well. I'm very lucky to have been connected to the two of you all, and maybe Marilee will say more about how that happened, and it's kind of a fun story. But welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for being with us. I am, as Ed said, a writer. I've been a journalist and also a content creator for about 25 years, really focusing on the work world, technology and business, leadership. I was a journalist at a publication called Workforce magazine for several years, about 8 years. The last 6 years, I've been the senior director of content and/or research at Great Place to Work. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Great Place to Work. I'm trying to take a little poll here. Okay, and most of you guys have. All right, we're the research and consulting firm behind the annual Fortune 100 Best Companies to Work For list. So we survey employees and research what employee sentiment is. And I've really been able to learn from the best workplaces and leaders. And that's actually led me to see a change in the way leadership is successful today. And so I've written co-written 3 other books, one of which is called A Great Place to Work for All, where some of these ideas about leadership and changing traits that really dovetail with the masculinity book, those all took shape there. I don't have an artistic other part of my life like Ed does, so much as my other part of my life is really being a dad and a husband, married to an artist named Rowena Ritchie, and have 2 teenagers. And they're a source of a lot of learning. And my son shows up in the book, and I dedicated the book to him as well, because I feel like he's really taught me how to be a better man. So with that, I'll turn things back to you, Marilee.
Okay, so the very short story is Ed Fraunheim, or as I say, Ed San Francisco, as opposed to Ed New Jersey, is also a Barrett Kohler author, as I am. And so we met at a number of Barrett Kohler events. And once when I was in San Francisco, Ed and I went out to dinner, and he told me about his avid interest in men and wanting to write about men. Aha, he said, I should introduce them. So I did, and the rest is history. So let's get started with what are really the main message. What do you want men to hear and understand and appreciate? And of course, what do you want women to hear and understand and appreciate? Whichever one of you wants to begin.
Well, I'll start with that, Ed. And I think the gist of what we want men to and women to understand is that masculinity, as it has typically been profiled in popular culture, isn't working, and it isn't working well. There's a lot that is, but there's too much that isn't. And for example, when men identify traditional ideas of masculinity as being progressing at the top of the heap, or being dominant, or being shaming, or being angry or aggressive, and not to express feelings, not to talk about things that are important, to be independent to the point of loneliness. None of these things are working for men. And when I see men in therapy, well, not only in therapy, but in general, we are so indoctrinated in that way of thinking that we don't challenge it, and we don't use questions to challenge our own gender. and gender rules. So this book, as a reinvention of masculinity, is portraying what doesn't work, and we have ideas as what does work. And one of the things that works, and we'll talk more about this as time goes on, is that compassion and connection are vital elements for men to reclaim. Men are extremely compassionate. There's a lot of compassion in men and a lot of connection in men, but men have typically disclaimed that as being a feminine trait, not a masculine trait. So one of our messages to men is that that's an identifiable masculine trait, as is connection. And we talk about connection in a broader sense. Ed can expand upon that. Ed, you got some thoughts in addition to what I just said?
Sure, I think that's a great summary, Ed. I'll maybe tackle the issue of Marilee, you asked about what can women find in this book, and how to read it. And we were a little nervous about calling this a book about liberating power of compassion and connection for men. You know, the word liberation comes and has that connection with women's liberation movement, and we were wary of sort of appropriating that term. But what Ed and I really realized over time was that men need liberating too. And we would ask women to sort of see that men have been really kind of confined by that traditional way of being. We actually call that traditional mindset around masculinity a confined masculinity. And so we would invite women to look at that carefully and see that men, even if men have been oppressors in many ways, they also have been oppressed by these norms, and to support men to notice ways in which women may have, had to adapt some of these more masculine, quote unquote, behaviors to succeed at work, for example, to be more dominating and aggressive, and emotionally turned off. But these are things that I think all of us need to work on changing, as all of us have masculine and feminine, parts of ourselves, we would argue. And so we really hope the message of the book is that this liberating masculinity that Ed was speaking about, compassion and connection, it frees men and everyone around us to live happier, healthier, and more connected lives.
And it sounds like this starts from the inside out. So it's how men think about themselves in terms of what it means to be a man, also what women think traditionally about what it means to be a man, and how we actually get constrained by our conceptions. And I mean, obviously, I've read every page of this book many times and lived it for the last many years. But it's really about expanding possibility, not being constricted by it. And so it's easy to think about what's constricted. And I think it'd be really cool to talk about expanding it. And what does that make possible for men and women and families, for workplaces, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, expanding upon something Ed said, I'm treating a man right now who is really working hard to expand his masculine identity, and his wife is accusing him in indirect ways of being too soft, too indecisive, too emotional, too this, too that. And so when that happens, when women aren't on board with men trying to move towards a more liberating masculinity, men get crazy. They don't know what to do. They don't know what a woman wants and what a woman doesn't want. And so our answer to that is to live your full humanity as a man. And women have to deal with that, or your friends have to deal with that, or your buddies that you go fishing with have to deal with that. But find your own interior identity, express your full humanity, and have the courage to do that.
And if I could pick up on that, I love what you just said there. And the inside out concept, Marilee, is very true. And as Ed put it, it takes courage for us guys to actually look more into our interior lives, into our emotional lives. We've been told ever since we're kids, boys don't cry, you know, stand strong. You're not supposed to have feelings, you know, that is soft, and soft is not manly. And so it takes a lot of bravery to enter that interior space, if you will. And another piece of that puzzle about looking inward that we talk about is the willingness to explore our own privilege and power. To many of us have this notion that we are self-made men, right? This idea that we're so self-reliant, we are a rock, we're an island, and we don't notice the ways we have benefited from social social structures, the way that work has been more set up for men than women, the ways that fathers are actually get a benefit when they're at work, as opposed to women who are penalized in terms of promotions and their experience at work. So it's really a willingness, when you talk about going inside out, merrily, to acknowledge that we are the products of our environment more than we probably recognize when we are growing up traditionally, and to be courageous and curious about those elements of privilege and their emotional landscape, to really move ourselves forward and to really live more full lives.
So you've just given an obvious opening, Ed, for me to ask, for you to expound about how does that show up in the workplace? And how do you think about that in terms of the leaders that you've been studying for all these years?
Sure. And this gets to how Ed and I connected well and merrily put us together, because while Ed was working on this psychology of men, and Ed was part of the rollout of the American Psychological Association's new guidelines for men and boys a couple years ago. He was on Good Morning America, Laura Ingraham. I was noticing in the work world that there was a kind of more a quiet consensus building that traditional ways of being a man don't work as well at work. And then there's three kind of features of workplaces today that I would call out. One is that they're faster, they're flatter, and they're more fairness focused. So the three F's. And by that, I mean, things are happening in the business world at a quicker pace than ever. New digital apps can come up and challenge an organization. And the old ways of being kind of the top-down male leader, a boss that's sort of like getting everybody's input and then making a decision and then telling everybody in the chain of command what to do, it's too slow. What organizations are realizing is they need everybody to listen and sense and respond at all levels of the organization. It can't be this very dominant leadership style. And that gets at this idea of flatter organizations where there's less hierarchy, more distributed power. And if everyone's going to be sensing and responding, they need to bring their best. That means you need to create psychologically safe workplaces, teams where there's more caring rather than scaring. That's what's proven to be effective in the 21st century at places like Google and other research finding this. And the last piece is this fairness one. In the era of Me Too and of Black Lives Matter and the racial reckoning that's happening throughout our society, throughout our world, men have got to be willing to understand their privilege and reckon with the fact that they've had more opportunities really than others, and they have to be allies and collaborative allies at that, to really be their best at work, to be most successful, and to help others succeed as well. So really the work world is calling for a different kind of masculinity. It's really calling for the kind of masculinity that Ed and his colleagues at the APA were surfacing, a more liberating one that has a wider set of options. So you can be emotionally available, besides kind of strong, where you can be more collaborative and you can be have an understanding of our interconnectedness. So this is really the kind of masculinity that is succeeding, where soft skills are now success skills, as you told me, Marilee. You coined that term nicely.
So, and I think it's important to to underscore that the research at Great Place to Work validates what Ed is saying. So it's not like these are nice ideas. When they look at what are the best places to work, they're also talking about business results. So
Yeah, if
it's
I could
not just, oh, this is nice. It's like, this is really what's being called for.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Marilee. Just to add a bit, we did a study in our 2018 book, finding the most effective leaders when it comes to productivity, agility, and retention were also the most inclusive. They were best able to build bonds of trust within their team and beyond. They were the most humble. They also were focused on purpose more than just immediate results. So these for all leaders, is what we call them, are very much in keeping with the kind of liberating masculinity we're talking about. And we can talk about some examples of these folks later on.
I have one more question, and then maybe we should open it up and just be talking together. Both Eds are also fathers of sons. And I think there are a lot of implications here for not only relationships with spouses, but also how do we raise our children, our sons and our daughters, to be awake to and generative of these kinds of possibilities for boys and as we grow, as they grow.
Well, that.
I'll lob one over to
There's
you.
no sound bite for that answer to that question, that's for sure. The data shows that younger men growing up today are different. They are more involved. They are more parentally connected. They are more able to express their emotions and their feelings. They're more willing to do that. They're more willing to be out there. But I'm always caution people that that could be terribly overestimated, that the power of confined masculinity is so powerful in our culture, in fact, around the world, that it would be just wrong to think that things are changing dramatically. But things are shifting. And what are they shifting towards? They're shifting towards men becoming more human. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. More fully expressive, more fully human. Taking off the masks, taking off the rules that don't work.
And you got to be careful with the take off the mask point though these days.
What's that, Ed?
Got to be careful with take off the mask as a suggestion in our current context.
Oh,
well, we're in Zoom right now. So.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true.
I know what you're talking about, but
right. You know, men don't come into my office and say, well, the reason I'm here for therapy, Ed, is because I'm too human. You know, or a lot of men come saying their wives want them to talk to somebody. And what is their wife or their girlfriend or their daughters wanting from them? They want more intimacy. They might want more connectedness, more involvement. They want to know their father. They want to be interactive with him. They want him to be more human. That's that. In our book, we describe that in many different ways and give real positive suggestions for how men can move themselves towards a more liberating, compassionate, and connected life.
And that's beautiful. One thing I'd add is that going back to your point about how to raise our boys merrily, I think one of the main things is to listen to them more. We so much have been raised in the traditional way to like kids aren't supposed to talk, right? They're supposed to listen to their parents. But I think one of the shifts is to say, let's be curious about what our boys are interested in, because they may not be football and baseball and being the king of the hill. And in my case, my son has taught me so much. There's an example in our book where he just shows such compassion. I took a wrong turn on the Grapevine outside of Los Angeles, which is a notoriously complicated roadway. And I was just like, yelling at myself and beating myself up. And my son said, "Dad, everything you are is already enough." It was just this beautiful moment of care and empathy and reassurance. And if we listen to our sons, as Ed said, the world is moving in the right direction. We can learn as older men from these younger men and our sons and help them, move in the right direction.
Yeah, Ed, you reminded me of something too that I want to make sure we talk about, and that is the idea of self-compassion. When we get into a discussion, we could talk about that. But if I give a workshop for men and I ask them how many men feel that they're compassionate, most men will raise their hand. But if I ask them if they are self-compassionate, they look at me like, I don't even know what you're talking about. In the Men Mentoring Men Center, there's a sign that says, "I never beat myself up gently." And self-compassion, as is compassion, is seeing one's own suffering and doing something about it, doing something to to take away that discomfort, that suffering, or that pain. And there's a set of skills for that as well. So I wanted to mention self-compassion as an important component of the change we're looking for inside men and women.
And which opens everything. So let's, Kim, this is a sort of a technical thing. Should we be putting questions in chat? Should we just ask people to raise their honest to goodness real own hand?
So there's a couple ways we can do it. I recommend if you have a question, you can write it in the chat, and I can call on you, or you can raise your electronic hand, which is your electronic hand is in the, you click on participants, and then right there you can raise your electronic hand and I can call on you. And we'll start off with David Boyd.
Hey, good afternoon. First, thank you very much, both of you, for having this. I'm really glad to be here. Full disclosure, I'm a men's coach myself, and I'm helping lead a men's organization currently that is creating men's groups around the world to do this kind of work.
Great.
Something that we've seen amongst some of our guys that already have groups and are coming in is that they're running into a lot of spiritual bypassing by the men that are coming into men's work. And that, that pendulum is swinging so far from the traditional masculinity side, way bypassing everything else. And they completely skip the pain. They skip the learning about themselves and how to process those things. I just wanted to get your guys' take on that as the men's movement shifts into this new paradigm of modern masculinity.
David, let me make sure I understand the question. So the question is about what needs to happen in that transition, in that process.
I'm just curious what y'all's take is on how to help men avoid that skipping where they go straight from traditional masculinity to way in their heads, skipping their heart, and skipping the emotional process, and they just forget about all the middle part. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, sometimes in therapy we refer to a flight into health. It's like going from point A to point B without going anywhere. I could answer that with a short way in the experience of men mentoring men, and there's over 100 men who are involved in that, and we've served many more over the past 30 years. But the way we structure the meeting, and I won't go into a great deal of detail, I can with you on another chat, David, but we start every meeting with appreciations. That way men learn to both recognize how to express appreciation and gratitude, and it starts the dynamic of the group in a very positive way. And men can appreciate each other, like somebody made a phone call, or they could appreciate their wife or something their son did, or something a friend said to them. Then we move into a clearing. A clearing is there anything in the way that is keeping you from being able to be fully present? It might have been something a man said to him a couple of meetings ago, but we make sure everybody's clear. Then we ask men for a time. Who has a time? A time, when a man raises his hand, a time means I want the floor. I have something to discuss. I want to share. And he has he asks for feedback or not. And then we ask who has B time. B time, over 30 years, I've recognized is always disguised A time. But B time is really when a man is saying, if we don't have enough time, I'll defer to the A time people. I try not to make the meeting like, I'm going to date myself here, like a Queen for the Day show when I was a kid, like whoever has the biggest problem, speak up. It's really designed for men to not only talk about current issues that they're dealing with in their life in a vertical way, not just surface way, but vertically. But it's also to bring up ideas that say, if I don't pay attention to this, it will become a problem. If I keep not speaking about my sexual dissatisfaction with my wife, we're going to grow further apart, or whatever it happens to be. So the group itself is designed to get men to crawl inside that space from wanting, from where they are, to becoming a more liberated man. And the process is with each other in a vertical kind of way. And it's not on clock time. It doesn't work on clock time. Some men get it right away. Some men don't get it at all, and some men it takes a while. But when we have one rule in Men Mentoring Men, and it's always been only one rule in 30 years: no man shames another man. Boy, does that cover a lot of territory. But when men become sensitive to shaming and they stop doing it to each other, it creates an environment of deep safety. And then men can feel free to learn to express vulnerability with other men.
I have to add to that, because I've known many of these men over the years. We have parties and we get to know each other, and the appreciation that they have for that format and for the invitation to go deep and authentic has changed their lives entirely. And when I connect with their partners or their wives, they are so appreciative of the man that they now have, who is different than the man they had before. So I've gotten to watch the progression of that over time, and enjoy it and appreciate what you developed there.
I wonder if I could also add that the to your point, David, about the bypassing, and in some ways we try to distill some of the lessons of M3 and what Ed just walked through in these, what we call the 5 C's, that are kind of our how to move your masculinity from more confined to liberating, and their curiosity, courage, compassion, connection, and commitment. And we have some questions and tools throughout the book on those things. And so there's, about people are sharing during A time. Well, we're encouraging guys to be compassionate, to listen and feel and kind of explore that interior life, not just sort of say, have the anger at the old one necessarily, but there's a kind of a willingness to feel sorrow and go to those darker places along the way, which I think maybe speaks to a little bit of what you're saying. So those 5 C's may be another way.
Good point, Ed.
Great, thank you. We have a couple additional questions. So we're gonna go to AP and then Cecile, and then there's 2 others.
Okay.
So AP, do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it or ask it?
You're on mute.
Yeah, that's the thing. I should know this after like 8 months of using Zoom, but here we are. Yes. Where do gay and bisexual men fit into the more liberating masculinity for all men? Like, where does that fit in? Because I'm on that spectrum.
What was the first part of that question, AP?
How do gay and bisexual men fit into the liberating masculinity?
Well, my short answer would be perfectly, because at least in Men Mentoring Men, we've had men come out as a result of being around heterosexual men in a safe way. We've had bisexual men admit to their bisexuality, and again, because of that rule, no man shames another man. And you're actually, we've learned after 30 years, actually to use the word love with each other. It's like there's a love for each other. And so We've had a gay couple where they attended every meeting, and in one meeting, one of them announced, he said, "Who would think that our best friends would be heterosexual?" And one of them passed away. And so a couple of the men, and the man who survived is legally blind. And so a couple of our members continually bring him to the meetings, drive him to the meetings. What happens is sort of the silliness of things goes away when men can learn to be safe and intimate with each other. It breaks through barriers. It breaks them down to the point of sometimes forgetting that they even had those biases to begin with. It's part of the miracle when men trust and feel safe with each other, and it's guided well. I mean, groups like this have to be guided well.
I would add also to your point, AP, that I mean, unfortunately, the confined masculine ethos, which is so dominant, is super homophobic, right? And it's been source of so much pain and trouble. And I think one thing that we would note is that it's part of this way in which confined men tend to have very limited sense of care. And there's a fear of other, there's a fear of sexuality, perhaps their own feelings of homosexual feelings. And when we talk about the liberating masculinity, you're much more feeling like everybody counts. You know, my circle of care and who I'm going to love, as Ed pointed, is expanded to include everybody. So it's definitely part of that model. And but I also would note that a lot of gay men struggle with some of the same issues that heterosexual and men do with respect to feeling connected. We have a section in the book where I spoke to fellows at an over 50 gathering of gay men in San Francisco at the cafe where I write, and they came together because there was a very strong feeling of isolation as gay men got older and they didn't fit into the club scene. They had lost a lot of friends during the AIDS crisis. And so they were really consciously working to rebuild those connections. And so we hope that our book can speak and offer some guidance to men of all genders and identities.
Thank you.
Good question.
Thank you.
Cecile.
About 5 years ago, I had a very interesting conversation in the context of this conversation with someone from Holland who said that the American Western destroyed the West's masculinity. That Europe had picked up on this and of all this independence, all this whatever, and that men had lost their stewardship. And it just opened up for me the fact that I was raised, and I'm not young, as you can see, by men who were good stewards, who cared for everything. Any kid that fell got patted on the butt, Bobo was kissed, and off they went. And just very comfortable with taking care. But listening to the conversation in Holland, the whole idea that that first of all, these men were not happy with the American Western and the harm that they saw that had been done. And I'm just wondering how your findings go along with that.
I could maybe jump in first there, Ed, to say that I think that's a great perspective. And to your point, yeah, the American Western sort of helped reinforce this idea of rugged individualism, right? And that we're not connected. We're not have any responsibilities to our land, to our communities, to our world. But I think there are some changes underway in the culture. You speak about movies, and when we talk a little in the movie about some of the ways that current and very popular movies or TV series, ranging from Game of Thrones or the Avengers series, is showing a very different kind of masculinity, one with more of a stewardship that's kind of taking down a peg or two the notion of the strong stoic hero winning and being the savior for everybody. Instead, it's more about, you know what, Iron Man or Captain America is going to lead a grief counseling session, which he did in the last Avengers movie, and it's going to take this community to really save the world. So I hope that there are signs that our culture is moving away from that, Cecile, toward a more kind of stewardship model.
And I think you're right in that what I'm seeing of young men is a much, much larger kind of stewardship. That's not only even that, you know, that their arms are much larger.
I love that quote.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're going to use that.
I want to get to Jane, and then actually just to tag on to that question where we ventured, and then we'll get to Jane. Yuri asked, are there cultures in the world that are more in line with your reinventing masculinity or modern masculinity perspective? Given that we were talking about Holland and...
Are there? Was that the question? Are there? I think the short answer to that is yes, because masculinity, at least gender roles, are culturally learned, and there's not a gender role gene inside you or me. So the culture dictates that, and cultures that stress connecting to the you know, I often think of Native Americans as deeply connected to the earth, finding the sacred in living creatures, finding ways to honor one another, to in our foreword of our book, which is written by Paul Gilbert. If you don't know Paul Gilbert, he's in England. Paul Gilbert is one of the leading researchers in the area of compassion. He talks about anthropologists finding that early men and women were a very egalitarian kind of folk who did not differentiate roles. They helped each other survive. They were not savages. They were not aggressive. They had their bouts and their fights and so on, but they're often portrayed as like these wild creatures, when in fact they were highly civilized. But when we began to farm and claim land, then we got territorial, and that's where Paul Gilbert articulates the beginning of role differentiation and greater and greater different roles for men and women, and greater competitiveness, which then built into the kind of masculinities we're talking about. So yes, I think there are vast cultural differences. Unfortunately, some of the cultural differences, the machismo cultures and so on, a lot of problems there. There's a lot of suffering going on because of that.
We could take any of these questions and go for hours.
Jane and then John.
Okay.
This is very encouraging conversation. I have watched this over time because I'm a little older. And I would agree, I've learned a lot from my son, and I think the culture is changing. But my question is, I'm curious what would prompt men to be interested in even thinking about this reinventing masculinity?
I could start there, Jane, because I think self-interest, survival is one powerful thing. In other words, the stick of having a place in companies as they evolve. Because I think that's one of the things we capture throughout the book, and we have a chapter devoted to it, is that if men cannot evolve their masculinity and move towards some of the ways in which we talked about earlier, they're not going to have as much of a welcome mat at organizations. You're finding that companies are now seeking, you know, in the words of Adam Grant out of Penn, givers, not just takers. And whereas the old masculinity is about taking as much as you can and being the dominant king of the hill, that's just not flying anymore. Men who are not being willing to examine their privilege and be very careful not to be mistreating women, or if they're white men, people of color, people of different gender identities, sexual identities. There's less and less of tolerance for that. So I would say one strong motivator is that. But Ed, maybe you can speak to the other one, which is happiness, in a fuller life. That's another piece of it's not just a stick, it's a carrot. You want to speak to that, Ed?
Yeah. There's a story in the book about a man that came into therapy and said to me, I've had a marriage that didn't work and a long-term relationship that has just broken up. And he said, the reason I came to therapy isn't to find out what's wrong with these women, but what am I doing? What am I doing that's making this happen? And on the surface, that may not sound like too dramatic of a question, but yeah, it is a profound question. And his therapy was centered on looking at the way he's relating, which then refers back to a lot of confined masculinity issues and some of his personal stuff as well. But I think men asking that question because they have suffered is one of the motivators. And if they are mature enough to say that suffering isn't, I'm not the victim here. I may be also the participant or even perhaps the cause, and I need to take a look at that.
That's wonderful. John, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I'm an engineer and a tech person, and that's by and large been a pretty male-dominated field, and especially in you referenced the indigenous times, but the Industrial Revolution also brought a huge amount of structure and the hierarchical structure. And so at an engineering education conference where we were talking about what's going to be the impact of artificial intelligence and some of these other things, the observation was made that for several centuries, we've been training our engineers, mostly male, to be better machines. And now we're going to have to train them to be better humans, which to the point you guys made earlier. So I'm curious about your view of the educational system and how it shapes that. And then just a comment that, we're moving out of the industrial age into a much less deterministic environment, which is, I think, causing some of the need for change. But curious about your thoughts on the education system in particular.
Ed, you want to?
Sure, John, great question. I love the human, trained to be human. That's such a great little line there. I think that one positive development that we touch on in the book that my son benefited from, he's a high school senior right now, is socio-emotional learning, the SEL movement, which is really kind of saying it's not just about might makes right on the playground. It's about how do you self-regulate, how do you manage conflict in a healthy way, skills that we didn't learn in my generation. I'm 53, and I don't think older guys did either, where you just kind of you had a pecking order on the playground as opposed to a peace order. It was more like who's going to beat each other up, and that you listen to the bully. So I think that's very positive. There's a lot more attention to gatherings like homerooms and other places where there's going to be check-ins. How are you doing emotionally? That's happening with my kids on their teenagers. My daughter who's a sophomore also. There is an attention to the full human expression, not just that we're learning robots. We are human beings trying to learn in a very strange, scary pandemic. So there's a lot of room to grow, I think, in the education realm, but I think more and more kind of personalized learning, more emotionally oriented or emotionally aware learning is happening. And to me, those are positive signs.
And that's great, Ed. And I would add to that, John, that it's going to require leadership within organizations to recognize the problem and institute ways to allow men to feel safe enough to talk about important things that may be strictly work related. In Marilee's lingo, to be willing to feel safe enough to ask important questions, to explore emotional reactions to things. There's much more to add to that answer, but I think top-down leadership plays a role in this.
Well, it plays a role both positive and negative, because I've, in startups, it kind of gets forced out in some cases, in others it gets reinforced. But
yeah,
there's a lot of senior and middle management that's wildly addicted to the dominant male.
Oh, absolutely.
Wildly addicted to
Yeah.
Which there's one other question that I think will tie it up, and then I know we're headed up to an hour. Yuri, do you want to ask your question?
You're on mute, Yuri.
That's a very unusual situation, but yes, you're right. I'm reminded of that Cherokee saying, listen or your tongue will make you deaf. That's part of what I've been doing for some time. I'm happy not to do it today. I just have a question about, are there any in the corporate world, are there examples of leaders that are merging in this way with your understanding of masculinity? And
Yeah.
do you see this really developing into a movement, or is it just a reaction to heroic leadership, but being more authentic and whatever all that means? I'm not sure authentic leadership fits into that. I'm hearing a lot of servant leadership, which of course is very much part of that. UPS, for example, is very much into servant leadership now. We're trying to get to that, as are other companies. But are there examples of the kind of masculinity you're talking about in the Anglo-American corporate world?
Yeah, I could jump in on that, Yuri. That's a great question, and all those terms are great. Servant leadership, authentic leadership. I've been honored to be able to interview a bunch of leaders at world's best workplaces and U.S. best workplaces based on what their employees say. These are also companies that tend to way outperform their peers on business results as well. And so a few that we mentioned in the book are Cisco's Chuck Robbins, the CEO of Cisco, and also Jim Weddle, a former top executive of Edward Jones, the financial services company. In Chuck Robinson's case, we tell a story in the book where he was basically not long into his position when he was just starting to notice the homelessness problem outside of Cisco's doorstep in San Jose, California, in the Silicon Valley area. And he had a dream in which he saw his father and his pastor's face in this homeless encampment. And he woke up the next day and said, I've got to get to be part of the solution here. He called the mayor and he initiated this, I think, a 50 million gift from Cisco regarding creating some supported housing in the Silicon Valley area. And that helped inspire the entire company to sort of elevate their philanthropy efforts and see themselves as more connected. And that also was part of him being part of the business roundtable, moving to a stakeholder model as opposed to a shareholder model that came out last year. And even more recently, this was not in the book because it happened just now. Chuck Robbins has led conversations about race in very tough, honest, frank ways about Cisco, bringing in top Black leaders of Cisco and asking, what's it like to be a Black employee at Cisco? He was reading White Fragility, the book before even the killing of George Floyd. So to me, he is a great example of this liberating masculinity, and he's part of a wider movement. So, I'll save the Jim Weddle example for another time, or check it out in the book. But I think there is something happening, Yuri, to your point, where some top leaders are becoming or are already expanding and becoming more liberated men.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed.
Ed, Marilee, do you want to tie the things together?
Well, this has been a very rich conversation, actually lasted longer than we were planning, but every part of it was really important. And what I hope for, and I know both Eds hope for, is not that this is a one-time conversation, but it's generative, like opening up the whole question about what does it mean really to be a man in today's world, and to expand our humanity and our possibilities and our connectedness with each other. And as you say in the book, the earth, which is obviously so important. So I'd love for this to be the beginning of series of conversations that people have, these are conversations that really need to be had. And I think you've done a great service in putting that in a book that can really push that out. So I'm appreciative to both of you for the book and the work and the courage to put it out. And now it'll be up to the courage of readers and thinkers and people to keep going with it. But you've opened a possibility. And do you want to say anything in closing?
Well, I just want to say that if I had a magic wand or you had a magic wand and we waved it and 10% of the world became more compassionate, we wouldn't recognize the world we're in. It is vitally, vitally important that men and women assume a more compassionate, integrated way of life. Our survival may depend upon it. Let's put it that way.
I agree with that, and I just want to thank Marilee for being matchmaker for the two Eds. Sometimes we joke about maybe it's the two-headed monster, but hopefully it's more the idea that two Eds are better than one. And we also want to invite you. We're going to be having kind of a more informal book open house type of event. What is our date again on that again, Ed? I just want to put that out in people's radar screen.
Good question, Ed. Is it Friday the
30th?
Yeah,
Friday the 30th.
Friday the 30th. Yeah.
It's not a Halloween party, but we could, if you want to come in a costume, that's great. But we'll if people are open to it, we'll put out a note about that too. If we can continue the conversation. And thank you for the beautiful comment as well, Olivier. I saw that in the chat. So just really grateful that you're all here and we could talk together today.
And one last thing, I want to thank Kim for coordinating this. Kim, thank you.
I feel very blessed to have been part of this conversation because it is so important in creating a compassionate world. And I hope everybody goes to their website, reinventingmasculinity.com, sign up for the newsletter. If you're on our newsletter, that doesn't translate to their newsletter. So please sign up for their newsletter so you can get notifications of additional blogs and conversations that they're having. And also, if you haven't bought this book for yourself or for a friend or a friend's friend, please go buy it. It's a wonderful book.
And thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.